You knew his face the moment you saw it. That jaw, those eyes, that effortless, almost unfair combination of presence and charm that made every scene he walked into feel like it belonged to him. Eric Dane, McSteamy, the man who sauntered onto Grey's Anatomy and immediately made half the world forget what they were watching before he showed up. The actor who built a career on being magnetic, untouchable, larger than life. But here's the thing nobody tells you about people who look like they have everything under control. They're often the ones who are the least okay. Because behind the roles, behind the red carpets, and the headlines and the image that Hollywood so carefully constructed around him, Eric Dane was fighting something. Something private. Something real. Something that doesn't care how famous you are or how many people think your life looks perfect. And when the truth started leaking out, when the carefully maintained surface finally cracked, and people started seeing what was actually underneath, it wasn't what anyone expected. Not from him. Not from McSteamy. The people who knew him said they should have seen the signs sooner. The people who didn't know him personally said they never saw it coming at all. And honestly, that's the most heartbreaking part of this entire story. Because it was hiding in plain sight. The whole time. Stay right here. Because what happened to Eric Dane is one of the most raw, human, and ultimately remarkable stories Hollywood has produced in years. And it starts long before you think it does. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning Hollywood likes to tell. Not the clean, photogenic version where the handsome kid from San Francisco catches a break and rides it all the way to the top. The real beginning. Eric Dane grew up in San Francisco, California. By his own account, it wasn't a simple childhood. His parents divorced when he was young. He moved between households. He navigated the particular kind of instability that follows a family when it fractures. The kind that doesn't leave visible marks, but shapes everything about how you move through the world. He was drawn to acting early, not because it was practical, not because anyone handed him a roadmap, but because something about inhabiting other people felt more manageable than sitting inside himself. If you understand that impulse, and a lot of people do, then you already understand more about Eric Dane than most profiles ever bothered to explain. He spent years doing what every actor does before the break. Small roles, guest spots, the grinding, humbling work of showing up and being overlooked and showing up again anyway. He appeared in shows you probably half remember, took parts that didn't define him, kept going, and then came Grey's Anatomy. Mark Sloan, Dr. McSteamy. The entrance was immediate. The character was everything the show needed at that moment. Confident, complicated, genuinely funny, and played with an ease that made it look like Eric Dane had been doing this at the highest level his entire life. The audience responded like a thunderclap. Overnight, and it really did feel overnight, Eric Dane was everywhere. Magazine covers, talk show couches, the kind of visibility that rewires your entire life whether you're ready for it or not. And here's the thing about that kind of sudden, massive attention. It doesn't care about your foundation. It doesn't ask whether you've built the internal infrastructure to handle what's coming. It just arrives, loud and total and completely indifferent to whatever was already going on inside you. For Eric Dane, things were already going on, quietly, below the surface, in the places that fame doesn't reach and cameras don't follow. And those things, they were patient. They waited. Here's what's interesting about Eric Dane's rise, and what makes his story so different from the standard Hollywood narrative. He never fully fit the mold people tried to put him in. McSteamy was a character, a great one, a character that audiences adored, and that gave Eric Dane a platform most actors spend their entire careers chasing. But Eric Dane the person was something more layered, more uncertain, more human than the role ever required him to be. People who worked with him on Grey's Anatomy describe someone who was warm and committed, and genuinely good at what he did, but also someone who existed slightly apart, someone who could light up a room and then quietly disappear when the professional obligation lifted, someone who was present and funny and magnetic, and who also seemed, somehow, like he was carrying something that had no name yet. His marriage to actress Rebecca Gayheart in 2004 brought its own public dimension to his life. They were a striking couple, beautiful and visible and followed closely by a media that treated celebrity relationships as sport. When their daughter Billy was born in 2010, followed by Georgia in 2011, the picture from the outside looked complete. Family, career, success, all of it. But here's what was happening in the spaces between those milestones. Eric Dane had been dealing with depression. Not the kind of depression that announces itself dramatically and demands immediate attention. The quieter kind. The kind that coexists with a functional life for years before it stops being manageable. The kind that lets you show up to set, hit your marks, do good work, go home, while something underneath is slowly, steadily eroding. He had also developed a dependency on prescription painkillers. The details emerged gradually and painfully over time. Not in the explosive tabloid way that Hollywood scandals usually surface, but in the slower, more honest way that real struggles tend to reveal themselves. There was a video, a private video that became very public in 2009. He and Rebecca and a friend. It was embarrassing. It was scrutinized. It was turned into a story that missed the actual story almost entirely. Because the actual story wasn't the video. The actual story was a man who was struggling in ways that didn't photograph well and didn't fit the image the industry had built around him. And the worst was still coming. 2012 was supposed to be a turning point. Mark Sloan's exit from Grey's Anatomy was dramatic, as exits from that show tend to be. The character died, the audience grieved, and Eric Dane stepped away from the role that had defined him publicly for 6 years. He wasn't done with acting. He had other projects. He was still Eric Dane, still that face, still that presence, still capable of commanding attention in any room. But something shifted after Grey's, when you've been defined by a character for that long, when millions of people have organized their emotional relationship with you around a fictional version of you. Stepping out of that is stranger and harder than it sounds. Who are you when McSteamy is gone? It's not a small question. For some actors, the answer comes easily. For others, it becomes the question that everything else orbits around. For Eric Dane, this period of transition overlapped with the period when his personal struggles were intensifying, rather than resolving. The depression that had been quietly operating in the background was becoming harder to keep in the background. The painkiller dependency that had developed, reportedly connected to a series of physical injuries, was a reality he was managing but not defeating. And the marriage that had weathered considerable public scrutiny was under its own private pressures. Rebecca Gayheart has spoken about this period with a candor that is both brave and heartbreaking. A household navigating one partner's serious mental health and addiction struggles, while also raising two small children, is a particular kind of hard. The kind that doesn't make you a bad person or a failed couple. The kind that just asks more than most people know they have until they're in the middle of it. Eric Dane checked into a treatment facility in 2011 to address his dependency on prescription drugs. This wasn't a tabloid moment. It was a person reaching for help, taking a step that is enormously difficult for anyone, and that is exponentially harder when you're doing it with the public watching. He got out. He kept working. He tried to rebuild. But rebuilding, as anyone who has done the real version of it knows, is not a straight line. There was more coming. A role that would redefine his career, and a diagnosis that would redefine everything else. Fast forward to 2019. HBO's Euphoria arrived like nothing else on television. Raw, visually overwhelming, emotionally brutal, and completely uninterested in making its audience comfortable. It was a show about addiction, identity, trauma, and the particular hell of being young and in pain in a world that moves too fast. And at the center of it, playing a complicated, morally ambiguous, deeply human character named Cal Jacobs, was Eric Dane. The response was immediate and total. This wasn't McSteamy. This wasn't charm and jaw and effortless magnetism. This was acting. Serious, committed, terrifying acting that reminded anyone who had written Eric Dane off as a pretty face exactly what they had gotten wrong. He was extraordinary. Critics said so. His cast members said so. The audience, a new audience, younger and different from his Grey's Anatomy years, discovered him like he was someone entirely new. In some ways, he was. Because here's what made his performance in Euphoria so viscerally powerful, so impossible to look away from. He was playing a man whose addiction had fractured his family, whose secrets had built walls between him and every person who loved him, whose life had cracked along the exact fault lines that shame and denial create. Eric Dane knew that territory, not as research, as lived experience, and it showed on screen in a way that you can't manufacture, in a way that only comes from someone who has actually looked at themselves honestly, in the middle of real darkness, and survived it. His performance gave Euphoria some of its most devastating moments, and it gave Eric Dane something he had been working toward his entire career, a second act that was realer and more meaningful than the first. But just as that momentum was building, just as it felt like the best chapter was finally opening, something happened that nobody could have scripted. In 2023, Eric Dane revealed something that recontextualized everything. He had been formally diagnosed with depression, clinically, finally, in a way that explains so much of what had come before. The struggles, the dependency, the periods of withdrawal, the patterns that had confused and hurt the people around him, and that he himself hadn't been able to fully understand. He spoke about it publicly, carefully, with the kind of language that someone uses when they've done the actual work of understanding something rather than just surviving it. He talked about the specific weight of depression, about how it isn't sadness in the way that people imagine sadness. It's something heavier and stranger and more total. It rearranges your relationship with motivation, with pleasure, with the basic sense that tomorrow will be different from today. He talked about what it had cost him, the relationships, the years, the opportunities, the version of himself that might have existed if he had understood sooner what he was dealing with. And then, and this is the part that mattered most, he talked about treatment. Eric Dane revealed that he had undergone treatment with a ketamine protocol for his depression, a treatment that, for many people with treatment-resistant depression, has produced results that more conventional approaches couldn't reach. He described the experience as clarifying, as something that helped him access parts of himself that the depression had been blocking for years. He wasn't claiming a cure. He wasn't performing recovery in the polished, packaged way that celebrity wellness stories usually go. He was just telling the truth about where he had been and about what had started to change. It was the most honest thing he had ever said publicly, and it landed on people in a way that clearly surprised even him. But even as that honesty was resonating, even as people were responding to this new, raw version of Eric Dane, the personal cost of everything he had been through was impossible to separate from the story. In 2018, Eric Dane and Rebecca Gayheart announced their separation after 14 years together. It wasn't shocking in the way that some celebrity divorces are shocking. It wasn't explosive or ugly or publicly litigated in the press. It was quiet, and somehow the quiet made it sadder. 14 years, 2 daughters, a life built together across some of the most turbulent personal terrain either of them had navigated. Rebecca Gayheart has spoken about the complexity of loving someone who is fighting something that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with them, about how depression and addiction inside a relationship can make the person you love feel like someone you can't reach no matter how many ways you try. Eric Dane has spoken about the guilt, about knowing that his struggles had real impact, that the people who loved him most bore costs that weren't theirs to pay, that being someone's parent while being in the middle of your own war is one of the harder things a human being can attempt. He remained committed to his daughters, co-parenting, showing up, doing the unglamorous, necessary work of being present in their lives even when presence was the hardest thing to give. And through all of it, through the separation and the diagnosis and the treatment and the rebuilding, he kept working. Because work, for Eric Dane, has always been the thing that gives structure to everything else, the container that holds the rest of it. Euphoria continued. His character arc deepened, and the man delivering it was doing so from a place that was finally, slowly, starting to feel more solid. But there was one more chapter coming, one that none of his fans saw coming, and one that tested everything he had rebuilt all over again. In 2024, Euphoria's long-delayed Season 3 hit an obstacle nobody expected. Creator Sam Levinson and HBO faced significant upheaval around the show's future. Reports of production delays, creative disagreements, and uncertainty about the cast's return circulated widely. For Eric Dane, whose professional resurrection was so closely tied to that show and that role. This uncertainty carried real weight. He had rebuilt his industry standing through euphoria. He had reminded Hollywood what he was capable of. And now the vehicle that had carried that reminder was stalled in ways that were largely outside his control. How do you hold on to the progress you've made, personal and professional, when the external circumstances start shifting again? That question is one Eric Dane has had to answer before, in harder versions than this. And the answer he's arrived at is the one that therapy and treatment and hard experience tend to produce. You hold on to yourself, and you let the rest be what it is. Because here's what nobody tells you about recovery. It isn't a moment. It's a practice. It's something you do every day, in the choices that nobody watches, and the moments that don't make headlines, and the quiet maintenance of a life that keeps wanting to drift back toward its old grooves. Eric Dane has been public about the ongoing nature of his journey, not in a way that performs struggle for sympathy, in a way that's just honest about what sustained recovery from depression and addiction actually requires. It requires support, real support, professional, personal, structural, not just willpower and good intentions. It requires accountability to yourself and to the people whose lives intersect with yours. And it requires, most of all, a willingness to keep going even when going feels like too much. Eric Dane has kept going. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. If you want to understand what Eric Dane is working toward now, where the real motivation lives, you don't have to look at his filmography. You look at his daughters. Billy and Georgia Dane are growing up, and their father is present for it in a way that his depression and his dependency once made genuinely difficult. He has talked about fatherhood with a tenderness that doesn't belong on a red carpet, about wanting his girls to know a version of him that is honest, that has done the work, that shows them, through how he lives, not just what he says, that getting help is strength and not weakness. That's the inheritance he's trying to leave. Not McSteamy, not the magazine covers, not any of it. Just a father who showed up, who got honest, who chose recovery over the comfortable lie that everything was fine. And his story matters far beyond the celebrity dimension of it, because depression doesn't look the way most people imagine it looks. It doesn't always look like someone who can't get out of bed. Sometimes it looks like someone who shows up every day, does exceptional work, makes people laugh, and is quietly drowning behind all of it. It matters because addiction is not a character flaw. It's not what happens to weak people. It happens to people who are in pain and who find something that temporarily reduces that pain, and who then discover, too late, that the solution has become its own problem. It matters because treatment works. Not always. Not for everyone. Not in a straight line. But the gap between Eric Dane at his lowest and Eric Dane now is evidence of something real. His story gives people permission to name what they're carrying, to ask for help, to not wait until everything has collapsed before deciding that something needs to change. Eric Dane is still here. That sounds simple. It isn't. There were chapters in his story where the outcome was genuinely uncertain, where the weight was real enough and heavy enough that here was not guaranteed. He is working. He is parenting. He is managing his mental health with the tools and the support and the hard-won self-knowledge that years of honest reckoning produce. He is not fixed. He's not claiming to be. He's not standing at the end of the story with a bow on it and a lesson neatly delivered. He's just living, imperfectly, honestly, with a clarity about what matters that people only tend to find after they've come through something that almost took them under. McSteamy was a character. Eric Dane is something better. He's a real person who went through real things and came out the other side willing to talk about it, so that someone else might feel less alone. In a world full of curated images and managed narratives, and performance masquerading as authenticity, that kind of honesty is genuinely rare, and it's worth a lot more than any television role ever could be. If Eric's story moved you, if any part of it felt familiar or hit closer to home than you expected, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of his journey stayed with you, because stories like this one deserve to be seen by as many people as possible.